Okay guys, the last topic for this unit, we're going to be talking about the integumentary system, which is of course it's our skin. And the integumentary system is comprised of the largest organ of the body, which is in fact the cutaneous membrane, or as we commonly call it, the skin. Its function is basically protection. It does a lot more than that, but its main function is to protect the body, the internal systems of the body, from the outside world, which can be quite different than what we need inside. It's a very complex membrane, and it's way more complex than any of the other epithelial membranes that we talked about earlier. Now, the skin, the integumentary system doesn't just comprise the skin itself. It also includes the accessory structures. So when we talk about those, we're talking about hair, the hair follicles, glands, our fingernails. Those are all part of the integumentary system. And the function of the integumentary system is to more so protection. So it protects us from infection. It protects against dehydration. If our skin wasn't waterproof as it is, we would lose a lot of water through our skin to the environment, which could be very detrimental. It helps regulate the body temperature. We can sweat, for example, can cool us down when we're hot. It collects a ton of sensory information about the environment, relays that to the central nervous system for processing, and there's cells in our skin that help us manufacture vitamin D, which is essential in some of our metabolic reactions. So there's a lot of different things, a lot of different functions that occur in the integumentary system. Now there's a couple of different layers of the skin. The skin is made up of epithelial tissues that are stacked up on top of each other, and these cell layers together, they'll form different layers of the skin. So we have three layers that we're going to talk about. We've got the epidermis, which you can see right here, and that's going to be the layer on the very outside, so the stuff that you'd actually touch if you touch your body. Below that, you'll see the dermis. And then that's much thicker, and in the dermis we're going to find a lot of those structures that we talked about, some glands, hair follicles, blood supply, stuff like that. And then we're going to find below that we'll find the subcutaneous layer down here. This is often called the hypodermis. And hypo means below. So hypodermis means below the dermis. So that's the deepest layer of the integumentary system. Now each one of these layers are going to have accessory structures. They're going to come from various origins, which different types of cell types, or embryonic derivatives, but don't worry too much about that. But all of these things will work together for normal growth and to provide a really stable layer of protection. Now, the outermost layer of our skin, as I mentioned, is the epidermis. So this is the layer that's going to come in contact directly with the outside world. It's what you touch if you touch your skin. And it's composed mostly of those stratified squamous epithelial cells. So the squamous ones, remember, were what I call the fried egg cells, where the cytoplasm looked like an egg white, and then the nucleus looked like the egg yolk if you cracked it into a frying pan. And those are going to be irregularly shaped. They'll be all over the place. And those are the squamous cells. Now, stratified, remember, means that they're stacked on top of each other, so there's layers. This epidermis is avascular. So whenever you see A in front of a word, it usually means no or not. So asexual, for example, means not sexual. Avascular, vascular usually refers to the cardiovascular system. So when we're talking about vascular, we're talking usually about blood vessels, so capillaries, arteries, and veins. So avascular means there's no blood supply to the epidermis. It's composed of two layers. It's actually composed of 5, but we're only going to talk about 2: the stratum corneum and the stratum basale. Stratum basale is the deepest, and the stratum corneum is the one right on the outside, so we'd call that superficial. The cells here are mostly dead, but the ones that are living, the ones that are located in the stratum basale, they're going to be nourished by blood, vessels, capillaries, small blood vessels, that are found just in the underlying dermis. Now, we talk about these two layers by themselves. We've got the stratum corneum, and our stratum corneum is going to be this layer right here. Okay, so these cells that are kind of wavy, that's going to be our stratum corneum, right on the outside. These cells are highly keratinized. Now, keratin is a very thick, dense protein that we see in bird feathers, for example. We see a lot of it in our fingernails. It's a really tough, strong protein, and it's also very good at waterproofing. So by the time the cells arrive to the stratum corneum, they're mostly made up of keratin, this thick, tough protein that's really good in waterproofing. And then once they get out to the stratum corneum, they're often shed. Right? They're lost. They just come off. And that's the characteristics of the stratum corneum. Now, the deepest layer, stratum basal, which is going to be right between where the epithelium, where the epidermis and the dermis meet. So the stratum basal is going to be just 1 or 2 cell layers thick right in this area right here. These are the ones that produce new epithelial cells. Okay, so these are going to be actively dividing. So the way that our skin works, the way this works, is almost like a conveyor belt. So cells in the stratum basal down here, they'll undergo mitosis, and as they do, the cells will start to pile up on the outside of this layer. Now, as those cells move out into the epidermis, further out, before they get into the stratum corneum, they die. Right? They don't have any food supply. There's no oxygen because there's no blood supply, so they die. And as they die, before they die, they fill up with keratin. So the cells right on the outside in the stratum corneum are going to be dead, and they're full of keratin, and they fall off all the time. So if you think about the epidermis as a conveyor belt, the cells are produced in the stratum basal, and they constantly get pushed up. As they get pushed up away from the stratum basal, they fill up with keratin and they die. And that's what gives us the protection in the stratum corneum. So those skin cells are constantly falling off, and they get released into the air, and they just get basically deposited around as dust. A lot of household dust that you see around your house is actually dead skin cells that have built up over time. So we have those dead cells, and they're making up most of the dust in our houses, inside buildings. And then we also have a large population of these little mites, these little insects, and you can see the picture of them down here. So these are called dust mites, and they travel around, and they're quite small, microscopic. They move around in our dust, the little deposits of dust that we see around, and they'll eat those cells, and that's where they get their nourishment. Now, those cells in the epidermis, they're constantly shed through wear and tear. Rubbing your skin against a hard surface, some of those dead epidermal cells are going to come off, and they're going to be lost. So the cells that are in the stratum basal, the deeper ones, they're constantly undergoing mitosis to produce new cells. Now, what condition did we just talk about where constant cell division can be a problem? Think about that. So as those cells move further away from the stratum basal, the cytoplasm is going to be replaced by that protein keratin. And that keratin builds up. It's great for waterproofing. It's great for protection because it's really tough. And it gives us that protection layer that we have in the stratum corneum. There are some different types of cells that we'll find in the stratum basal. One in particular are known as melanocytes. So whenever you see the word cyte, that's going to refer to some type of a cell. And melano in this case is referring to a pigment. The pigment in our skin, melanin, is what gives our skin different colors. So human skin color comes from this protein called melanin, and melanin is produced in the cells called melanocytes. Now, below the epidermis, below those two layers, we're going to have the dermis. Now, the dermis is a much thicker cell layer than the epidermis, okay? I think in total, the epidermis is going to be somewhere around 40 to 50 cell layers thick. Well, the dermis is hundreds, so it's a lot bigger. This is going to have, you're going to find a lot of connective tissue in the dermis. It's also going to have vascular tissue, so blood vessels, the blood supply, and there's also going to be nerves and stuff there. So it's a much more complicated tissue than the epidermis. Some of the accessory structures that you're going to find in the skin, and in particular in the dermis, is going to be touch receptors that give us our sense of touch, pressure receptors that allow us to feel pressure. We'll also find sweat and oil glands. I'll show you those in a couple of seconds. We'll find nerve endings so that we can get information from our environment, and also hair. The dermis is really, really elastic, so it can stretch, no problem, and it'll have very, very little damage by stretching or changing shape, unless it's extreme, of course. And this is going to be particularly important for cases such as pregnancy, for example, where the skin stretches quite quick. But it'll stretch, and then it can return back to normal with minimal damage. Portions of the dermis will actually extend upwards, and when it extends upwards, we call it a papillae. And we'll be able to see those on the slides when we check those out in the lab, no problem. And then a lot of times these papillae, especially on our hands or our toes, they can be the basis to form our fingerprints. So here's a look at cross-section of our skin, of our integument system. Have a look over here. We've got the epidermis, the dermis, and the subcutaneous layer, or the hypodermis. So those are the three cell layers that make up the skin. If we look over here, you can see this layer, the stratum basale. So this is going to produce the cells, and the cells are going to move up towards the outside of the body. As they do, they're going to fill up with keratin, and they'll die, and they'll provide us with our layer of protection. Here are the papillae that we're talking about. Every time that the dermis rises up into the epidermis, we call that a papillae, and that's going to be part of the basis of our fingerprints. Sorry. There's two glands that we'll find in the dermis. The first one is the sebaceous gland. That one produces oil, and it is always associated with a hair root or a hair shaft. So if we look at this hair root right here, this is the hair. The root extends right down into the dermis. These structures right here, that's going to be the sebaceous gland. And of course, we have another one over here that's labeled. We're also going to have the sudoriferous glands, and that's this one right here. This is an exocrine gland. Remember, it's a coiled tube down here inside the dermis. It secretes sweat, water, and the water travels along this duct till it reaches the surface of the skin, where the water droplets build up, and when it evaporates, it takes the energy away in the form of heat and helps cool us down. Now, below the dermis is the subcutaneous layer, or the hypodermis, as I've mentioned before. This connects the skin to the surface of the muscles, so there's going to be lots of loose connective tissue there, and that's where we're going to find fat. Okay, so any fat laid down, that's where we're going to find our adipose tissue. So we'll have loose or areolar connective tissue, and we'll have adipose tissue right where the subcutaneous layer meets the muscle. The thickness of this layer is going to vary, of course, depending on the fitness or the condition of the individual body. Blood vessels will flow through this layer fairly consistently, and this will help us in regulation of body temperature or thermoregulation.